Hello and welcome to this human rights conversation. Our topics for today: what does the holiday season mean for disabled people? And as the United Kingdom prepares for its political conference season, is the party over for political parties? With me to pull the threads on all of these issues is my co-host, the consultant, activist, university teacher and former UK government advisor, Miro Griffiths. Miro, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you.
Excellent. So, to our first segment, Miro, how has the holiday season been for you so far?
Well, on the personal note, I have had a holiday, but it wasn't a great experience. There was a number of aspects of discrimination I encountered when trying to try to arrive back in the UK from France. So, as a wheelchair user, I was using my car on the Eurotunnel, which is when you put your car on the train, and because of the infrastructure within the terminal, there was no accessible facilities for me to use the toilet after having food poisoning the night before and desperately needing the toilet. So when I spoke to Eurotunnel, they talked about their policy of fairness, of treating all customers the same, and therefore they wouldn't provide any discretion or reasonable adjustments to allow me to actually gain access to an earlier train, other than actually paying for that service. So whilst I was being marginalised by the infrastructure and the policy that were being in place, the ownership was on me to sort out my own problem by paying more in order to move across the border. So there were issues there around. It was a bad ending to my holiday, but on the other hand, it's something that is regularly experienced by the disabled people as they try to navigate opportunities of leisure and tourism, because we encounter numerous barriers, not only within our own countries, but also when we travel as well, and the logistical nightmare of trying to get our access needs met.
We talked off camera, Miro, about the evolution of the purple pound, which is the purchasing power of people with impairments. What can the people with impairments do to make companies more aware of their needs so that they respond more appropriately to the needs of disabled people?
Well, I think there are numerous options to take. So firstly, we'd want to see improved legislation which protects the rights of disabled people to access goods and services. And there is existing legislative frameworks that offer us that. But the problem is some of it is not enforced, some of it is misunderstood by the providers of services, as well as disabled people are not aware of their rights. So there are numerous issues there which are problematic on the ground for when people actually experience discrimination and marginalisation. I think some of the recommendations and ideas coming out of the EU and the European Commission, I think, has been quite exciting around trying to address issues of accessibility for disabled people, reduce the barriers to accessing services and goods. But there is recognition that disabled people are wanting to engage in their communities, are wanting to actually be experiencing consumerism and aspects of consumption. And what needs to happen is there needs to be a better understanding of the legislative frameworks from both sides, from customers as well as providers, but there also needs to be more collaboration between services and disabled people in order to create a better process for people to access. Because the issue should be that whilst you have policies in place, if you're a service provider, you actually want to demonstrate a discretion and flexibility within that in order to meet the needs of people who access your services. The idea of treating everyone the same doesn't really work if actually people are being marginalised and discriminated against. So what we want to see is a better understanding of what we mean by disability, and that includes having disability equality training, that includes taking a social model of disability approach, i.e. it is the barriers within society that disabled people, not the individual's impairment or health condition. And what we want to see is better collaboration so that we can come up with proactive solutions that actually ensure that the service is being provided to everybody, but also recognises that people have different access needs when they engage in services.
Is the issue one of a lack of services for disabled people, Miro, or is it a lack of affordable services?
Mistakenly, we think about, well, actually, leisure is not as important as issues around employment or social security or personal assistance to meet people's access needs. But actually, it's all part of the same picture. I think when we start pulling the threads on on one aspect, we realise how interconnected they are to the other issues as well. So leisure is important, and it is being discussed. And I think the primary issues are how you just focused, what you just focused on there. So there's two directions that can be taken here. One is on how services do not think about the access issues of disabled people, nor do the commissioning frameworks take that into account. So, for example, what I'd want to see is when organisations are bidding to provide contracts, are bidding for contracts in order to provide services such as trains or local bus links or building, new hotels and those kind of aspects. What you'd want to see within the commissioning framework is say, well, how are you going to work with local activists on the ground to ensure that this is accessible for people with a range of different access needs? How are you going to ensure that within your turnover you will provide a sustainable policy to ensure that disabled people will be able to understand where to go to get more information, to have their access needs met, in order to actually experience the service on offer? So there are a number of issues on that side of the fence that need to be addressed. But on the other hand, there is this kind of problem around affordability. And there are numerous different levels to take at this. So again, if the majority of disabled people statistically are in poverty or require access local authority services, and within those provision of services, they say things like, well, you can't have X amount of money in reserve in your bank account, or you can't receive gifts, or you can't go on holiday with your current care package. This then restricts disabled people in order to actually have access to the community and to engage in those opportunities to actually experience wonderful experiences, but also have the time to rest and recuperate. Because the importance of leisure shouldn't just be about consumption, consumerism, which we talked about before, but it's actually about having that space to reflect and think about these issues. So leisure is essential to this. But I have seen numerous cases where disabled people are not allowed to go on holiday, they're not allowed to leave the country, because the idea is, well, if you've got enough money for that, then we will reduce your funding from the local authority in order for you to pay for to have your own needs met. And the logistical nightmare which you've kind of highlighted there around transporting personal support packages, which are not taken into account when people have their support needs assessed by local authority or local government or national government support schemes. All of these issues demonstrate the numerous barriers from organisation down to actually practicalities of going into a new environment or going into a different environment. There's a numerous barriers at all those different stages which have yet to be addressed. And there is not one way to do that. So we don't have to say that responsibility should be on one group to address that. What we need is a multifaceted approach which which provides the opportunities to create a more inclusive and accessible system, which from the point of view of the provider, from the provision of support for disabled people, for the disabled person himself to recognise. But again, there are so many barriers that are encountered by disabled people as they try to travel and experience. But there are problems. There is a deeper issue here, which goes beyond just the idea of disabled people have money to spend and businesses should be able to tap into that. I'd want us to go much further than that and recognise that actually there are great examples of disabled people travelling, of moving around, of exploring new environments, and that's great. But there is also numerous amount of people who don't get any of those opportunities. And what I'm interested in is ensuring that we create a fairness and safe and accessible infrastructure which provides all disabled people and their families opportunities to engage in travel and tourism.
You mentioned there, Miro, that tourism and leisure are important for people with impairments. They're also very important for the economy. Isn't the fundamental issue, isn't the elephant in the room here, that travel essentially means movement? Movement is a key concern for people with impairment. And that when you bring all this together, it's about how do you have the least costs for the most gain. I know that you don't want to frame this debate solely in economic terms, but that's basically it. Isn't this a clear example of where disability rights really has to make a breakthrough? Because people are just constant, or the people who are involved in these very important sectors of our economy are just interested in the bottom line. And all they can see perhaps is that if they reach out to people with disabilities, that's going to raise their costs.
But the problem then is that when they do reach out, they reach out to the groups which have minimal access requirements, and then use that as a way of tokenistically saying, well, we are making improvements. Look, we have new disabled people engaging in our services, but actually these are people who have the less complex access requirements compared to other marginalised groups. What I would say is I think the key here is there is an issue around creating profit, and we acknowledge that. But this is why I want to see more emphasis placed on legislation and having awareness of the legislation, which does protect the individual and give them a right to access that environment and having access to those services. But equally, this is why I think that it's fundamental that we get commissioning rights, so that when organisations and companies do bid for pieces of work, there is a written expectation that in the procurement process you have to demonstrate how you're going to provide an accessible and inclusive system, and that does require collaboration with local disabled activists and their organisations. Because I don't want to see flying in different professionalised disabled consultants to advise on areas when there is already a network of activists on the ground that can provide that. But I also want to see more opportunities for services to take responsibility and recognise that actually there is not only a right to provide a service, but there should be an expectation, morally and ethically, that we want to provide services for all, and we don't want to necessarily just place conditions on everybody who comes into the service to say, well, I'll only really accept you if you're going to help me create more profit from my company.
All right, I get that, Miro, but people will push back and say, well, that's going to make procurements more expensive. If at the end of the line it's about legislation then becomes a blunt instrument to tackle a problem. What's the honey in this for these commercial companies? How do you reach out to them and say, look, by doing this, you meet your social responsibilities and it's good for business, in the same way as companies had to make themselves more open to different ethnic groups, to women, to people of different sexual orientations? How do you incentivize business to take the needs of disabled people more seriously?
Well, again, if you're at the planning stage, you can build into the infrastructure provision of accessible services, whether that be policy or infrastructure or training, and that will actually have it will create less costly interventions along the line in terms of when people perhaps take things down the legal route because they've been discriminated against, or whether then they have to provide a change of services in the future. So if we get things right at the beginning, I think there is a less demand then to constantly create expensive changes to the service down the line on that scale. So I think getting things right from the beginning is key to this. But the other issue is that when you provide a more inclusive service, which meets the needs of of different groups, you're not just necessarily going to improve the service for one group of people. You will provide a more inclusive service for everybody. Yeah, and that's right. And again, we've seen the emergence of ethical organisations where people want to actually think about the moral and social concerns of organisations. I think that's where we should be moving towards as well. Why are we happy to use services which say, well, actually, if you're a disabled person and you want to have your needs met, you'll need to pay more? Or actually a service which says, we don't even care about your existence. We have no interest in providing services to you. We should be placing more demands to say, as all of us, as consumers, and as people who are actually driving the market, we want to be very selective about where we choose to place ourselves, and actually we want to ensure that this service is accessible for everybody in my community, as opposed to just being selective. But that goes back into the issues around politics, which we've just been talking about prior to this topic. So that's a bit more complex in trying to push forward. But I've had discussions with CEOs of companies who have talked about trying to maximize profits and reduce costs, and the issue of disability comes up to it, and it is one of recognizing that sometimes we have to acknowledge that it isn't all about just trying to create profit, and we need to actually recognize that there is a moral and ethical responsibility to create a society where we want people to feel welcome. And to do that, it not just relies on parliamentarians to create legislative frameworks, or the consumers to actually say, this is what I expect from a service. We also want companies themselves and the people who work within those companies to say, I want to change in this as well. So, and this is why you see, organisations with mass turnover who don't provide great infrastructures for disabled people. I think a lot of that doesn't come from the idea of, I don't want to do this because it's too costly. It's just they never even considered it at the planning stage. They never even considered it. They brought in a non-disabled person to advise them on issues around accessibility for disabled people without actually consulting or collaborating with disabled people. And that's where we need to focus our attention on. Sometimes we just need to bite the bullet and say, this idea of profit issues is an unnecessary distraction sometimes.
It's clear from what you say that what you can't offer to business is the idea that if they were to better cater to the needs of people with disabilities, they would make more money. But you're saying that the profit motive can't be the be all and end all in this conversation. But for people involved in business, it is. That's the real world.
Well, it is. Yeah, I can acknowledge that, but also it's about the ethical and moral responsibility. So, for example, if in the future you have other organisations say, well, we want to provide this, and it may mean that our profits reduce, but it means more people will use our services, you will have more of a groundswell going in that direction. And we've seen that now through the emergence of cosmetic industry, looking at those kind of issues.
Ethical tourism.
Ethical tourism. And I think there is a movement now there needs to be a movement towards acknowledging that some of our organisations and services and industries are taking are distancing themselves from saying, I want to provide an inclusive service, and I will selectively choose people based on the amount of money that I can take from them. And I think that is where the conversation needs to go now, is that recognition that there is a sign which is big. No salespeople wanted in this service, and I think we need to try to emphasise as consumers, for example, non-disabled consumers, are you happy to pay money into the service, knowing that disabled people, friends, family, local people in your community, people coming here from outside the area, that you are accepting that they should be discriminated against because the service wants to just make more money, as much money as possible.